Here's what your history teacher never told you about the Doolittle raid. All 16 bombers crashed. Every single one. The textbooks show you the brave pilots taking off from the USS Hornet. They show you the bombs falling on Tokyo. They show you Jimmy Doolittle with his Medal of Honor, grinning at the camera. But they never show you what happened next. They never show you 80 men falling through darkness over a country they couldn't see. They never show you the Chinese farmers who pulled broken American bodies from rice paddies full of human waste. They never show you those same farmers being burned alive 3 months later because they helped. And they definitely don't tell you about the 250,000 Chinese civilians who died because of what those 16 planes did. This is the story of the Doolittle raid you were never meant to hear. Not the 30 seconds over Tokyo, not the bombs, the crash landings, the captures, the executions, and the massacre that followed. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. In the weeks that followed, America experienced something it had never felt before. Genuine fear. Real terror. The Japanese seemed unstoppable. They took Wake Island. They took Guam. They swept through the Philippines like a typhoon made of steel and fire. American morale was in complete freefall. The country needed something, anything, to prove that Japan could be touched. That the empire wasn't invincible. That America could strike back. Enter James Harold Doolittle. Doolittle was already a legend by 1942. He'd won the Schneider Trophy. He'd set transcontinental speed records. He had a doctorate from MIT in aeronautical engineering. And now, at 45 years old, he was being asked to do something that violated every principle of military aviation known to man. The plan was elegant in its absolute madness. Load 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers onto the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. Sail within 400 miles of Japan. Launch the bombers. Bomb Tokyo in broad daylight. Then fly to China and land at friendly airfields. There was just one problem. B-25s could take off from an aircraft carrier. The calculations worked, barely, but they could never land on one. The bombers were too heavy, too fast, and too long. Once those planes left the deck of the Hornet, they were never coming back to it. This was a one-way mission from the moment it was conceived. The math required absolute perfection. The B-25s would have enough fuel to reach Japan, drop their bombs, and continue another 1,100 miles to airfields in Chechao, China. Barely. The margin for error was measured in gallons. Everything depended on launching at the right distance, 400 miles from Japan, and everything depended on those Chinese airfields being ready to receive them. But the Chinese were never told. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. The political situation was too delicate. The fear of leaks too great. Chiang Kai-shek's government received vague hints about needing certain airfields prepared, but they were never told when, never told why, and never given the resources to actually do it. The homing beacons that should have guided the bombers to safety, they were never installed. The runway lights that should have pierced the darkness, they were never turned on. Because on April 18, 1942, when 80 American airmen needed those airfields more than they needed air itself, no one in China knew they were coming. And that wasn't even the worst part. At 7:38 a.m., 650 miles from Japan, 250 miles further than planned, a Japanese patrol boat spotted the Hornet. The boat was sunk within minutes, but not before it likely radioed a warning to the mainland. Admiral William Halsey made the call. Launch now. Launch early. Launch at a distance that made the fuel math absolutely impossible. Jimmy Doolittle climbed into the cockpit of plane number 1. The deck of the Hornet pitched violently in heavy seas. The takeoff roll was 467 feet less than half what a B-25 normally needed. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle's bomber lifted off the deck and headed toward Japan. Behind him, 15 more bombers followed. None of them had enough fuel to reach China. For 5 hours, 16 bombers flew toward the heart of the Japanese Empire. They flew alone. Radio silence was absolute. Each crew of 5 men could see nothing but endless ocean and empty sky. They flew at wave-top height to avoid detection so low that salt spray coated their windshields and sometimes crashed against their fuselages. The pilots did mental arithmetic the entire way. They calculated wind speed, they calculated fuel consumption, They calculated how much further the early launch had cost them, and every calculation ended the same way. They were not going to make it, but they kept flying. At 12:15 p.m., Tokyo time, the first bombs fell. Doolittle hit a factory district in northern Tokyo. Lieutenant Travis Hoover bombed another section of the city. Captain David Jones targeted an oil storage facility that exploded in a pillar of black smoke. Plane after plane crossed over Japan, dropping incendiaries and high explosives on a nation that believed itself untouchable. The raid was over in 30 minutes. Militarily, the damage was insignificant. A few buildings burned. 50 Japanese civilians died. Some factories were damaged. Nothing that would change the course of the war. But psychologically, the impact was seismic. Japan had been struck. The emperor's capital had been bombed. The divine wind had failed to protect the homeland. The war cabinet went into panic. Resources would have to be pulled back to defend the home islands. The illusion of safety was shattered forever. The 16 bombers turned west and headed toward China, and now the real nightmare began. The early launch had cost them 250 miles of fuel. The headwinds that had plagued them approaching Japan vanished, replaced by tailwinds that pushed them toward China faster than expected. This was good news. The tailwind bought them precious distance, but it also brought them to China early. Too early, before the sun set properly, and then the weather turned against them. A massive front had moved in over the Chinese coast. Clouds stretched from the ocean surface to 23,000 feet. Visibility dropped to zero. Rain hammered the aircraft with violence that none of the pilots had ever experienced in their entire careers. One by one, the 16 bombers entered that wall of blackness, and one by one the fuel gauges dropped toward empty. At nightfall, they began to search for the airfields that were supposed to save them. They tuned their radios to the frequencies they'd been given. They listened for homing beacons that would guide them to safety. Nothing. Static. Silence. The airfields existed. They just weren't ready. The runway lights were dark. The beacons were silent. China had no idea that 80 Americans were falling out of the sky looking desperately for a salvation that wasn't there. Captain Ted Lawson, piloting a B-25 nicknamed the Ruptured Duck, described what came next in terms that still haunt readers today. We had no alternative. There was no hole in the overcast. We could not see land. We could not see water. We didn't know if we were over mountains or rice paddies. We had maybe 10 minutes of fuel left, so we did the only thing we could do. They bailed out. 73 of the 80 Doolittle raiders bailed out of their aircraft into darkness over China. No parachute training, no jump experience, just terror and gravity. Some landed in trees and hung there until dawn, praying the branches wouldn't break. Some landed in rivers and nearly drowned before they could cut themselves free from their parachutes. One man, Corporal Leland Factor, landed in a cemetery. He spent the night surrounded by Chinese graves, thinking he'd landed in hell itself. The ones who landed in rice paddies had it worse. Chinese farmers used human waste as fertilizer. The paddies were essentially open sewage pits. Men landed injured face down in pools of human excrement. Chinese farmers found them, pool of human excrement, cleaned them, hid them. These were subsistence farmers people who had almost nothing, and they shared what little they had with complete strangers who'd fallen from the sky. But not everyone was so lucky. 2 men drowned when they landed in the ocean off the Chinese coast. 5 were captured by the Japanese within hours of landing. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's crew landed near Japanese-controlled territory. They were arrested before they could reach safety. 3 of them would be executed. 1 would die in captivity. Only 1 would survive the war. Captain Edward York faced a different problem. His plane was damaged and leaking fuel. He couldn't make it to China, so he made a decision that would haunt him. York made a decision. He turned north. At 2 p.m., his B-25 landed at a Soviet airfield near Vladivostok. The crew expected to be interned briefly and then return to American control. They were wrong. The Soviets held them for 14 months. York and his men were moved from camp to camp, treated as diplomatic problems rather than prisoners. They eventually escaped across the Iranian border in 1943, but their war had been spent in Soviet custody, not fighting. For the other 69 airmen scattered across China, survival came down to one factor: the Chinese civilians who found them. Farmers pulled Americans from wreckage and hid them from Japanese patrols. Villagers gave them food when they had little themselves. Fishermen carried them up rivers toward friendly territory. Missionaries translated. Guerrillas guided. Without the Chinese, almost every one of the Doolittle raiders would have died, and the Japanese knew it. Within weeks of the raid, Japanese intelligence had mapped every crash site. They knew exactly which villages had helped the Americans. They had names, they had faces, and they had orders. Operation Sei-go began in May 1942. The official objective was to secure the airfields the Americans might have used to prevent future raids. The actual objective was punishment. 20,000 Japanese troops swept through Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. They burned everything. They killed everyone they suspected of helping the Americans. They killed plenty of people they didn't suspect of anything at all. In Nanchang, a city of 50,000 people, the Japanese methodically destroyed every building. They executed civilians in the streets. They raped thousands of women. When they left, the city was rubble and ash. But the killing didn't stop with conventional warfare. Japanese Unit 731, the Biological Warfare Division, responsible for some of the most horrific experiments in human history, deployed to the region. They contaminated wells with cholera. They released plague-infected fleas. They spread typhoid and dysentery through villages that had no way to fight back. The epidemics killed tens of thousands. Englin was a farmer who had hidden one of Lawson's crewmen in his home for 3 days. When the Japanese found out, they didn't just execute Ma. They gathered the entire village. They made everyone watch. Then they burned Englin alive. His crime was giving an American a bowl of rice. Father Wendelin Dunker, a Catholic priest who helped several raiders escape, described what he saw when he returned to his parish. They shot any man, woman, child, cow, hog, or just about anything that moved. They raped any woman from the ages of 10 to 65, and before leaving burned the town and killed all the survivors. The final count is almost impossible to verify. The Chinese government later estimated 250,000 civilians killed in the reprisals from direct violence, from starvation, from disease. 250,000 people, for a raid that damaged a few buildings. This is the part of the Doolittle raid that no one talks about. The textbooks celebrate the bravery of the 80 men who flew over Tokyo. They don't mention the price paid by the Chinese who saved them. And here's what makes it even more complicated. American military planners knew this would happen. They knew the Japanese would retaliate. They knew Chinese civilians would suffer. They briefed Doolittle on the likelihood of reprisals, and they went ahead with the mission anyway. The morale boost was worth it. The psychological impact on Japan was worth it. The demonstration that America could strike back, that was worth 250,000 Chinese lives. At least that was the calculation, made by men who would never see the bodies. 3 of the captured raiders, Hallmark, Pharaoh, and gunner Harold Spatz, were executed by firing squad in October 1942. The Japanese held a show trial, convicted them of war crimes for bombing civilian areas, and shot them in a Shanghai cemetery. Lieutenant Robert Metter, another prisoner, died of malnutrition in December 1943. The remaining 4 captured raiders, George Barr, Robert Hite, Jacob DeShazer, and Chase Nielsen, survived 40 months of imprisonment. They were tortured. They were starved. They were kept in solitary confinement for years. When American forces finally liberated them in August 1945, they weighed less than 100 pounds each. DeShazer would later return to Japan as a Christian missionary. He said he forgave his captors. He spent 30 years in the country that had tried to kill him. Forgiveness is complicated when so many people are dead. Jimmy Doolittle expected a court-martial. He got a Medal of Honor. 2 months after the raid, he was promoted to brigadier general, skipping the rank of colonel entirely. He spent the rest of the war commanding air forces in North Africa and Europe. He died in 1993 at 96 years old, an American hero by any measure. The raid itself is remembered as a turning point. Not militarily, the bombs did almost nothing to Japan's war machine. But psychologically, it changed everything. America had proven it could reach Tokyo. Japan suddenly had to defend its homeland, pulling resources back from the Pacific. The myth of Japanese invincibility cracked, and 4 months later, at Midway, that crack became a chasm. The Doolittle raid worked. By the cold calculus of war, it was a success. But the question lingers. Success at what cost? In China, the reprisals are not forgotten. Memorials stand in Zhejiang province, marking the villages that were erased. In 2015, Chinese President Xi Jinping publicly acknowledged the Doolittle raiders and the Chinese civilians who helped them, a rare moment of alignment between nations. But China remembers the suffering more than the heroism, and who can blame them? The children of the Doolittle raiders have worked for decades to honor the Chinese who helped their fathers. They've raised money. They've built monuments. They've tried, in whatever small way, to acknowledge a debt that can never truly be repaid. Because here's the truth about the Doolittle raid. 80 men volunteered for a one-way mission to strike the enemy. 16 planes took off from a carrier deck into uncertainty. All 16 crashed. 3 men were executed. 1 died in captivity. 1 was maimed. Dozens were wounded. They were brave, that's beyond dispute, but their bravery cost 250,000 people their lives. People who never volunteered. People who just happened to live in the wrong province. People whose only crime was basic human kindness. That's not a simple story. That's not a story that fits on a medal or plaque or a textbook page. That's the story of war itself, where courage and catastrophe walk hand in hand, where the line between heroism and horror disappears in smoke and fire, where the consequences ripple outward for generations. The next time you see a picture of Jimmy Doolittle grinning beside his Medal of Honor, remember the villages that burned so that photograph could exist. Remember Ma Englin, executed for offering a bowl of rice. Remember the Chinese farmers who saw American bodies falling from the sky and chose to help anyway, knowing what it might cost them. Remember the 250,000, because history doesn't get to choose which parts we remember. That's our job, and some stories need to be told, complete even when the ending isn't heroic at all.